Saturday, June the 5th, 1982, Nassau. Please turn in the Chumashim to page 588. Page 588 in the Chumashim, I read from chapter 5, commencing with verse 1 on page 588 in Chumashim, which is our reading for this morning, the first third of the Sidra of Nassau. And the Lord spoke unto Moses, saying, Command the children of Israel that they put out of the camp every leper, and every one that hath an issue, and whosoever is unclean by the dead, both male and female, shall ye put out. Without the camp shall ye put them, that they defile not their camp, in the midst whereof I dwell. And the children of Israel did so, and put them without the camp, as the Lord spoke unto Moses, so did the children of Israel. I'd like you also to enter into the record of what we're discussing this morning, another exclusion, not identical, but of a similar order, which you will find on page 515. Begins at the bottom of page 514. The injunction that we just read from the 5th chapter of the book of Numbers deals with excluding all Israelites who are afflicted by these issues. It's not, by the way, the word issue is not too clear, but seems to relate to some form of venereal disease. I'm reading from the bottom of page 514. And the Lord spoke unto Moses, saying, Speak unto Aaron, saying, Whosoever he be of thy seed throughout their generations that hath a blemish, let him not approach to offer the bread of his God. We're not dealing with the Israelites in general now. We are dealing with the priests and the Levites who have the specific obligation to minister in the temple or the sanctuary. For whatsoever man he be that hath a blemish, he shall not approach, a blind man or a lame, or he that hath anything maimed, or anything too long, or a man that is broken-footed, or broken-handed, or crook-backed, or a dwarf, or that hath his eye overspread, or is scabbed, or scurvy, or hath his stones crushed. No man of the seed of Aaron, the priest that hath a blemish, shall come nigh to offer the offerings of the Lord made by fire. He hath a blemish, he shall not come nigh to offer the bread of his God. He may eat the bread of his God, both of the most holy and of the holy. Only he shall not go in unto the veil, nor come nigh unto the altar, because he hath a blemish, that he profane not my holy places, for I am the Lord who sanctify them. Also, I would like to read into the record for this discussion two of the themes that are in the Sidra of Nassau, which we did not read today, but which cannot be totally ignored because they gave the theme. One of them gives the theme for the Haftarah, which Mitchell chanted so beautifully this morning, namely the Nazirite. There's no question at all that the Nazirite also relates to the theme of being excluded. The difference, of course, is that whereas in the 5th chapter of the book of Numbers, the exclusion is external, that is to say, the person who is suffering from these particular diseases or who has become contaminated by the corpse is excluded. And in the case of the 22nd chapter of Leviticus, the 21st chapter of Leviticus, this is something which is done to a person for something over which he has no control. The Nazirite chooses to be excluded. And in the being excluded, we also notice that there are certain external characteristics, such as the fact that the Nazirite must let his hair grow long. Now, we have to be very careful in our culture where hairstyles change from month to month. I understand short hair is in right now, but it wasn't so long ago that long hair was in. We must be careful not to misinterpret these phenomena from the past. We have to understand long hair of this order of the Nazirite was not regarded as socially acceptable. That is to say, the Nazirite who decided to become an ascetic, to give up wine and strong drink for a period of time, was regarded as somebody who was not supposed to look good. That is to say, when he was supposed to look unkempt. No, it wasn't the long, sleek look. It was shaggy, unkempt. The implication of "let no razor come upon his head" indicated that he was to look, well, I suppose a little bit like the gentlemen who wander the streets, who spend the night in the park, and who also have long hair, but don't look, as if they do it deliberately. It's just something that, it's unkempt, it's disheveled. There is something almost unpleasant about it. And finally, the other theme of exclusion related in all these instances to the notion of blemish, disfiguration, being maimed, being a cripple, smelling badly, having some issue coming from some part of your body, a scab or some kind of growth or some kind of cancer, something that is defective and something that is disgusting. The woman accused of committing adultery. We won't go into the details of what actually happens there. We deal with this in the fifth chapter of the book of Bamidbar, which we only began to read this morning. At any rate, and I am just the messenger that brings you the news. I don't endorse these ideological positions. In those days, the woman would be accused by her husband of having been with another man. She had to go through an ordeal. And the ordeal was that she had to drink certain water with which certain ritual had been performed and in which certain words had been blotted out, the words of a curse. And the crucial verse is verse 22, verse 21. The priest shall cause the woman to swear, we're on page 590, with the oath of cursing, and the priest shall say to the woman, "The Lord make thee a curse, and an oath among thy people, when the Lord doth make thy thigh to fall away and thy belly to swell. This water that causeth the curse shall go into thy bowels, and make thy belly to swell, thy thigh to fall away." It's not exactly precisely clear. It is not exactly precisely clear what this means literally and physiologically, but it's not good news. It clearly means that the woman is disfigured, probably disfigured genitally, certainly that she is grossly sexually unattractive, both to her husband and to other men, and the belief is that this punishment comes to her, that she is excluded. So, what we have done thus far is to read several examples from our sacred writings where a very clear message is being given. And although not all of these writings deal with exactly the same kind of person or persons, sometimes it's a woman accused of committing adultery, sometimes it's a man who wants to adopt a higher level of self-control and become a Nazirite, sometimes it is somebody who is a leper or who has some kind of physical disease, and sometimes it's somebody who belongs to the house of Aaron or is a priest or a Levite and is not permitted to enter the sanctuary and conduct services in the temple and offer sacrifices to God because he is crippled or lamed in some respect or other. But the theme that runs throughout is a theme that I must confess I am ashamed exists in sacred tradition, and I am conflicted about how to deal with this theme. I am conflicted as to about how to deal with this theme. That is to say, well, when you love somebody, or you love something, you tend to be defensive, like your mother, or your father, or your wife, or your husband, or your child. Automatic response when you love something or somebody, or an ideology, Zionism, Judaism, communism, capitalism. You tend to be very defensive. And I think all of us are guilty of defending in situations of love, defending in situations where we care about something or somebody, that we tend to stretch a point, that we tend to ignore the reality. It often happens, for example, in connection with school and with education, that somebody complains about a child or to the parents. Now, of course, there are two ways to do this. There are some parents who get so defensive that they're prepared to destroy the whole school because their child has been criticized. The other side of the extreme, which I don't want to deal with this morning, is when the parents are only too ready to believe any kind of criticism about their child. They have no confidence whatsoever in the child, and therefore the slightest complaint by anybody, no matter how unfounded, they will punish the child without even checking it out. That's the other side of the problem. I'm dealing now with a kind of defensiveness with which we tend to defend those we love. And of course, this is true about Judaism. How often have I wriggled and slithered all over the place in trying to justify the traditional Jewish attitude towards women? It is indefensible. There's no way in which we can honestly and authentically stand up in 1982 and defend either the biblical or the rabbinic attitude towards women. We can find arguments and excuses. Moreover, we can make some defense of an argument that we shouldn't radically change the way in which we conduct our Jewish lives, even to the extent of contemplating the issue of women rabbis or not women rabbis, in view of possible dangers to the solidarity and the unity of the Jewish people. Those practical and pragmatic issues are not related to what I'm talking about right now. The fact that deep in our hearts we know that somehow there are certain things in Jewish tradition which are unconscionable, ethically and morally, and we have to say it loud and clear, even if we can't always immediately act on those issues. And here we have an issue which I think comes under the same rubric, but which I would like to show in a different light, because I think the issue is not simply that it occurs in the sacred Bible. That is to say, it is not simply the case that we are faced in the Bible, our sacred writ, with an attitude towards the lame and the halt and the infirm and the smelly and the unwashed and the unkempt, which is an ancient perspective which we will stand up self-righteously and say, we disagree with this. We don't like the idea that people who are crippled should not be able to worship. We don't like the idea that people who are crippled. We could put up a good case and say that from our point of view, perhaps a person who is crippled is better to serve as a minister in the sanctuary because he is more in touch with anguish and with pain and with contempt and with despite and all those shocks that people who have some kind of misfortune are heir to. No matter how hard we try, the fact is that people who are overweight or obese or gross in some physical respect have a hard time, even if it's as simple as not being able to find clothes to fit them. Did I say even so simple? Perhaps that's one of the biggest problems. You hear women who are not exactly cripples complaining bitterly, I went to this shop and to that shop and the other shop, and I couldn't find anything that would fit. And they say it with a pathetic sadness. This is all part of the same order. Perhaps one might put forward a good case that precisely what one might call the number 10, precisely the number 10 is both male and female, is supremely unsuited to approach God. Because such a person, having been the focus of so much praise and so much adulation, is someone that one could put forward a good argument of being totally incapable of transmitting the needs of the Jewish people to their Maker. Totally unsuited to be sensitive to the needs of the downtrodden. And it's curious that the Bible, which sees God, especially in the prophetic writings, as being extraordinarily sensitive. I, God, who dwell with the lofty and the high, am also with the contrite and the broken in heart, and those who anguish, and those who mourn. Young lady, would you like to pay attention to me? Because I've got something interesting to say, and I'd like you to listen. If you keep on talking to your friend, I'm not going to be able to concentrate, and you're missing these priceless pearls. Imagine you're in school suffering for the next 40 minutes. What more can I say? But I can't talk when people are talking to each other. In other words, I'm suggesting that we might, not only do I disagree with Jewish tradition, I think it's wrong. I think it's wrong. I think a good case could be put forward for saying that a cripple would make a better priest or a better rabbi. That someone who has suffered in some way, who has had some anguish, who has members of the family who've been in Bellevue, who knows what depression is, who knows what bereavement, who knows what loss, who knows what physical sickness is in his own body and his own mind, is better attuned to the needs of the community. How can our Jewish tradition, which we always pride ourselves on speaking about as being a tradition of compassion, how can it be so naive as to make a radical separation between number 10s and those who don't register on the graph? What the readings that I read to you this morning say, without any shadow of doubt whatsoever, is the Jewish God doesn't like people who aren't number 10s. Now, the relevance of what we're talking about today is because we live in a civilization where the preoccupation of our ancestors is an epidemic. You see, one can understand why our ancestors made this distinction, because it was a universal distinction, and why should our ancestors have been different from any other people in the ancient world? It is tragic to read the history of the human race and realize that in the pre-modern eras, those who were afflicted were regarded as wicked. It's only within the last 100 years or so that those who were mentally sick were not chained to the floor in cold, dank dungeons and whipped because they were deranged. It is not so long ago that people who had physical disorders were banned from any kind of human contact. Leper colonies, one thinks of. And all you have to do is to read one book which describes the Middle Ages to know that in the Middle Ages, cripples and hunchbacks were all regarded as being evil people. Old ladies who began to smell and look slightly unkempt were burnt as witches. That is to say, a direct correlation was maintained between the way you look and your moral status. And this again is an idea which cannot be countenanced by us today. And therefore one can make allowances in terms of a document that comes to us from almost 3,000 years ago, 2,000 to 3,000 years ago, that it accepted the prevailing notion that physical disorder and physical disease was wicked and sinful. What I want to draw your attention to is that, ancient though this problem is, and justifiable in a sense as the attitude of our ancestors may be held because nobody else felt differently. After all, by the same token, we can say that Judaism, which is a religion which speaks of freedom, whose main festival, whose national birth is celebrated in Passover, Zaman Cherotenu, the season of our freedom, nevertheless the Jews held slaves. There are innumerable laws in the Bible which indicate how those slaves should be looked after. Question is, how can Jews, how can the Israelites, who speak so volubly about freedom, nevertheless have slaves? One of the answers is, well, they did have slaves, but they treated them nicely, as if that made any difference. Like the Jewish women in Black Harlem used to say, well, I gave them all my leftover clothes, as if that somehow justified the relationship. You were going to say something on this point, Jeff. Is it germane to what I'm saying? I'm in the middle of a thought. Go ahead.
I was wondering if the illnesses which these people bore were perhaps associated with some evil which was brought by the Jewish people that they had already committed and were being punished for.
Yes, that's a good question. Jeff raises the question of whether there was a belief that these diseases were in fact the effect of a moral cause. The answer is certainly true with regard to leprosy. The word leprosy in Hebrew is sarat. The man who is a leper is called mitzorah, mem, tzadi, vav, resh, ayin. And the rabbis, by a play on the words, make mem, tzadi, vav, resh, ayin, mitzorah, yield motzi, shem, ra, motzi, ra. That is to say, slanderer. That if you tell tales behind people's backs, if you are malshin, what we call in the Yiddishized Hebrew, lashon hara, that we all enjoy so much, that produces leprosy. So the leper was automatically assumed, and incidentally in the Bible, Miriam, who bad-mouths Moses because when he was exhausted, when God was dictating the Torah to him, took a second wife who incidentally was black. Miriam, who complained about Moses acting out, was punished by God with leprosy. So you are right. But it doesn't really help us because, well, I was going to say we know that disease does not come about because of sin, and yet in fact we don't know anything of the kind. That's a whole different subject. There is a vast area of psychosomatic medicine where a lot more diseases than apparently we imagine, if not are instigated, at least are not discouraged by certain mental attitudes. People have gone even so far, I don't agree with it, but there are people who have gone so far even to suggest that a frame of mind can lead to things certainly like stomach ulcers, but even things like cancer, bodily disorders, psoriasis, skin diseases, and so on and so forth. At any rate, our ancestors held slaves because everybody else held slaves. What sort of a justification is to say, well, we treated them nicely? If you believe in freedom, there should be no slaves at all. What sort of nonsense this is to defend the institution of slavery by saying, we treated our slaves better? That's the kind of Jewish apologetics that I find totally insincere and hypocritical. We have to come out straight and say slavery is wrong. And our ancestors were primitive. They lived in a world where, because there was no advanced technology, everybody had to have slaves in order to survive, more or less. Each one of us, because we have dishwashers and pumps and electricity, personally owns at least 500 slaves. We would need at least 500 slaves to carry us up every day to where we live in our apartments, bring in water from the reservoir in Central Park, cook, bake, vacuum clean, wash dishes, wash clothes. It's very easy for us to say slavery is bad if we lived in an era when there was no electricity, if we lived in an era where every drop of water had to be carried by a bucket from the river. We'd have slaves pretty quickly, and we'd find some beautiful rationalizations to maintain our sense of moral purity, but to have slaves by rationalizations all the same. How deceitful is the heart, Jeremiah said. And the longer we live and the more we know about the human heart, the more we realize how subtle are our rationalizations. The fact of the matter is that we cannot defend our ancestors for having this horrible view that being crippled means being immoral or being sick. We can't really defend it by saying it was widespread. All we can do is to say we come from an ancient and honorable tradition, and that tradition changed and grew. We are happy to say that certain things which were regarded as moral 3000 BC were no longer regarded as moral 2000 BC. And there were certain things that were regarded as moral 2000 BC which were no longer regarded as moral 1000 BC. Those who drafted the Declaration of Independence and spoke of life and liberty and the pursuit of happiness, for the most part held indentured slaves. What has happened is that at that time, having slaves was not incompatible with the current meaning of the word liberty. Today, with all the defects of the 20th century, at least we can't rationalize that one away. With all the problems involved, we declare equality. With all the pain in that declaration, you cannot have slaves and masters. We all are equal. We all certainly must be treated equally. Perhaps we aren't all equal. That's something else again. But certainly we all ought to be treated equally. So the word liberty changes and attitudes change in the Bible. What I'm really getting at, however, is the fact that this attitude is very deep-seated today, and all of us have fantasies about ugliness and about crippled and about disease and sickness, even ourselves. When the doctor telephones us and tells us that the diagnosis is malignant and not benign, the biopsy is malignant, we feel somehow that we have done something wrong. The first thing that comes to our mind is that we have committed a crime, that we are some kind of a moral leper. We weigh up in our minds whether we should tell our loved ones, or whether we are ashamed, whether we should keep it to ourselves. Who should we tell? We don't want to talk to people about our sicknesses. We skulk, we sulk, we go for long walks, we go in on ourselves. Deep down we feel that if we really were decent, wholesome people, number 10s, this awful thing would not have happened to us. There are people who feel this way even when some loved one dies. I'm not talking about a loved one who dies at a ripe old age, but if somebody dies prematurely, the first question they say to the rabbi is, what did I do to deserve this? I read to you from an ancient document which probably dates from well over 2,000 to 3,000 years. Certainly the ideas go back to that extent. And how different are we today with all our sophistication, with our Brook Shields and our number 10s and our commercial advertisements. I remember when I was teaching at Brooklyn College and we were discussing the mythology of number 10, even though the concept had not yet come into existence. one of the young ladies who came from the third world, I won't be more specific, whom I found rather attractive, began to weep in class one day. And after class, I asked her to come and talk to me about what it was that upset her. I thought that maybe something that I'd said had upset her, which after all is not unusual. May happen any moment. And she said that she was sick and tired of seeing all these Sybil Shepherd Coca-Cola commercials. We had been talking about the mythological nature of commercial advertising, how that the people who draft these things may not themselves be aware, but they are touching on very deep, universal, unconscious mythological paradigms. You know, the whole notion of the way in which Coca-Cola is, I won't go into all the details of the way in which it's done, because some of the stuff doesn't bear repetition in public. It really attaches us to, it really goes for us on our most subliminal, unconscious gut levels. The whole notion of life and resurrection, that somehow the people that drink Coca-Cola are number 10s. There's nobody there on those commercials who has an issue, or who is crushed in the stones, or who has one leg shorter or longer than the other. Oh, no, sirree. And what this young girl from the third world was crying about was that Sybil Shepherd was blonde, straight hair, blue eyes, not a spot or speck on her skin. I've heard people groan, people who could do to lose a few pounds of weight, groan at those commercials which make it clear that all you have to do is to drink one can of Tab every morning, and you too can fit into a bikini which is about this big. Pain, the suffering, the anguish. What we do is we set up, it's all right, we laugh now because we Jews don't need this now. But go back to the era of Marjorie Morningstar. We don't have so many plastic surgeons docking Jewish noses today. Maybe Jewish self-esteem is a little higher than it used to be. But 50 or 60 years ago, there was an epidemic among Jewish circles of Jewish girls who wanted to be peroxide blondes and who wanted to have their noses docked because being Jewish was being a cripple. And the advertisements in black journals in those days, but to a much lesser extent today, when black people have had the sense to speak of black being good, and that beautiful Afro hairstyle is something that is a pleasure to behold and to wear, as opposed to the days when unscrupulous people sold bleaching for the skin and chemical materials which would unkink the hair if one was prepared to go through the agonies of lying down on an ironing board every night and for your mother to iron and iron and iron. Even Jewish girls with frizzy hair felt uncomfortable and envied those long, lank Horace Mann locks. Yes, back row. I'm sorry, could you stand and talk louder, please? Thank you very much indeed. There is not much of a step between our obsession with Brooke Shields and our inability to want to have condominiums in which young children can live, which I understand is quite widespread in certain parts of the country, where children are not permitted to live in certain areas. And excluding certain kinds of people from where we live. For example, an urban renewal policy that very subtly refuses to accept the implications that in order to have a balanced community, we need to have the poor and the rich living in the same area, that we can't segregate the have-nots from the haves. This is a very serious contemporary issue in American urban planning. And we know on the Upper West Side how delicate and sensitive an issue it is. And this issue is the issue we are discussing right now. What a well-balanced ratio is of haves and have-nots in any community, I will not enter into now. That is a political decision. Whether or not there ought not to be exclusive have areas, and therefore exclusive have-not areas, is not a political issue, but a religious and moral issue. And we declare that situation to be immoral and alien to everything we regard as holy, in spite of the fact that our ancestors also had this notion. The argument over what we should do with people who are released from mental hospitals, who are not dangerous to the community or even to themselves, but who might walk around our towns and frighten our children. In the Middle Ages, every little village had its fool, had its idiot. Today, even some congregations have the same phenomenon. So what? So we have a few schlemiels running around. There are plenty running around in Brooks Brothers suits, believe me. This is the whole issue. I'm not saying at what point putting people from mental hospitals onto the streets is governed by issues of the availability of federal funds. Here we are reaching into political issues. But the issue of whether there are or are not certain kinds of people who are not harmful to themselves and others, but whom we don't care to see outside our front doors because they make us aware of the fact that not everybody is a number 10. I'm ashamed to tell you that sometimes when I jog around Central Park Reservoir in the morning, I have the most incredible bestial fantasies that only number 10 should be allowed to jog around the inner circle, and that all people over, well, unfortunately I'm over the age already, but let me fantasy, you see, and over a certain weight and height and who, don't run flippantly enough should be condemned to the bridle path where they can be ridden down by horses if the people who ride the horses don't like them. I'm not proud of these fantasies, but I've had these fantasies from time to time. When we go to a cocktail party and, just give a look around who's in the room, don't we all feel that we'd rather speak to people who could go on the front page of Time magazine rather than a bunch of paraplegics? There is a painting in the Louvre by a man called Ghirlandaio, one of the most beautiful paintings that I know. It's called The Old Man and the Child, and the old man is so ugly it's almost sinful. He has some kind of disease. You can diagnose, a modern doctor can diagnose the disease just by looking at the painting. Carbuncles, boils, scurvy, flaking skin, dandruff, pimples, you name it, he's got it. A bulbous nose, double chins, goiters. And the little child is looking into his eyes. And it's one of those trompe-l'oeil paintings. All you have to do is to look at the painting for a couple of minutes. You know those paintings, those designs, geometrical designs, you look one way and you see a lion and you see a clown running. Look at that painting for more than a few minutes and you suddenly see the ugly, crippled, disfigured old man through the eyes of the child. And the man is no longer ugly even to you because the power of love has transformed it. If we could only learn to love and empathize with those who don't qualify to become number 10s, we will be doing ourselves a service. Because as my good friend in the back row pointed out, Hitler believed that Jews were crippled. Hitler believed that the Jews were crippled. Or rather, stronger, he believed that the Jews were vermin and that they had to be destroyed. And unless a whole nation had not been sold the idea and been convinced that they could indeed do anything to Jews because Jews were vermin and had to be exterminated like rats or like cockroaches, the final solution would never have got underway. People would have revolted against it. It's hard to see a connection between Brooke Shields on the front of Time magazine and Auschwitz. My dear friends, I urge you to reflect on that connection today and to reflect on what we do in order to continue this notion that only those people who are the beautiful people deserve our attention. The irony is that very often the number 10s are very unhappy people. One only has to bring to mind Marilyn Monroe. One only has to bring to mind a Romy Schneider. One only has to bring to mind any number of number 10s, both male and female, who have a problem because they are so attractive. Everybody thinks that attractive people are the luckiest people in the world. It simply isn't true. One always knows the story, the constant plaint of the pretty girl. Does he love me because of my brain or because of my body? Honey, you'll never know. The fact of the matter is that this becomes a serious problem for women and for men. You never can know whether people really like them for what they are or because of some extraneous. And ultimately, mature human relationships simply are not related to size or shape or vital statistics. Otherwise, everybody who ever had a mastectomy would have to be burnt on some funeral pyre. Or everybody who ever had some kind of an operation would immediately be rejected and divorced. It's quite true that sometimes this kind of a tragedy leads to divorce. But when it leads to divorce and separation, it raises profound questions about the quality or lack of quality of the relationship which preceded the episode. We live, therefore, in an age when the issues raised in the Siddur this morning are very much with us. And sometimes it's not even a question of physical or physiological disfiguration. Some of us attended a very interesting dialogue which took place in the synagogue on Thursday night. I hope there will be many more of them in the future. It wasn't perfect. Nothing is perfect. There are no number 10 sermons. There are no number 10 dialogues. There are no number 10 rabbis or priests or whatever else. Life is a trade-off, and we always have to trade off one thing against the other. It's interesting. What interested me most was not so much the viewpoints, which I think all of us had heard before. There was almost a ritual quality in what we were doing. We were going through a kind of, it was almost like davening. It was important to go through a ritual evocation of certain words and certain concepts, even though most of us could have told the lecturers a thing or two and could have possibly given the same kind of talk, perhaps not with the same oratorical ease. What struck me most forcefully about the night was that Rabbi Seymour Siegel, who believes in the virtue of the moral majority, and Rabbi Balfour Brickner, who's way out on the left, were able to meet in our house, our synagogue, and discuss and debate and leave without rancor and without enmity. You see, one of the greatest tragedies in America today is that people who don't share our opinions are regarded as cripples and lepers. And there's a strong feeling growing in certain areas of the country that those who don't share our identical views on abortion, on birth control, on teenage sex, are below consideration, and we're not far from vermin, scum. And then the question is, what do you do with such people? Do you put them in prison? And if they're in prison, do you sterilize them? Or do you get rid of them? It's not a very long... The road to Auschwitz is very easy. It's a slippery road. Once you start on it, you get there very quickly. Don't think it can't happen in America. And don't be encouraged in the belief that it may not happen to the Jews, because there are other minorities that come before the Jews. Remember what that German Christian pastor said when Hitler came for the communists? I didn't say anything because I wasn't a communist. And when Hitler came for the homosexuals, I didn't say anything because I wasn't a homosexual. And when Hitler came for the cripples and performed the euthanasia, I said, I'm not crippled and my family are all healthy. I didn't say anything. And when he came for the Jews, I didn't say anything. And when he came for the Christians, it was too late. What I'm saying is the issue of your Brook Shields versus your Auschwitzes, the link between them. It's a very subtle link, and it's very easy to move very fast on those lines. Left this very moving debate, where, as I say, the most moving thing about it was the fact that most of the audience behaved pretty sophisticatedly. It wasn't like a Meir Kahane JDL meeting with people booing and hissing. There was a little bit of irreverent applause, in which I must say that at one moment I participated myself. Even rabbis are human. Went home, turned on Channel 13, what else? Couldn't go to sleep. There was the most incredible debate going on about these very issues that we're talking about today. The moral majority versus school principals discussing whether or not certain books should be banned from school libraries, whether or not children have a right to read what they want to read, whether a handful of parents in any given school who do not want their children to read certain books have a right to control the entire community, whether the minority has a right to control the majority. No one is denying that people have a right not to want their children to read certain books. Our democracy is built in such a way that parents have a right to destroy their children within certain quite serious limits. I don't mean kill them physically or prevent them having blood transfusions if they're Jehovah's Witnesses. What I mean is a democracy inevitably permits parents to emotionally cripple their children with very little control. I noticed there was an interesting ruling last week where a judge said, I can't remember the exact details, can somebody help me out, that the judge ruled that unless there were very serious reasons to the contrary, the child had to stay in the house even when there were good reason to believe that the mother was not able to look after him properly. And this is a sacred principle, because the worst mother is better than the best nurse or the best foster parent, I think. There's a certain subtle something between mother and child which nobody can completely replicate. It was a terribly moving experience to see a member of the moral majority very cleverly, brilliantly, suggesting that the biblical story of creation should be taught as a scientific account alongside of scientific versions, because the scientists cannot prove demonstratively, and they can't of course, that Darwin is right, and that therefore, since they believe that the biblical version of creation is the true one and is as scientific as the other, since no one can prove which is scientific and which isn't scientific, that therefore the biblical story should have as much place as the scientific one. I was very disappointed to hear the opponents of that viewpoint saying that the Bible wasn't science and the Bible was religion. I was very unhappy to see that none of the people who spoke went right to the heart of the question. Of course the Bible must be taught at school. The Bible must be taught at school, but not either in religion or in science. It has to be taught in a course devoted to mythology. What the creation story in the Bible is myth, and it belongs in a comparative study of all other myths, and it has a very important scientific value, because the myth relates to something very crucial and important in the psyche of both the individual and the collective group which generated the myth. But everybody is so afraid of what's being discussed, but that's not the main issue. The main issue was that as I slowly began to fall asleep, and thanks to the congregation, I no longer have to get out of bed and switch the television off, but I just take my magic box and go, I am indebted to you for making my slumbers that much more pleasant, because once you get out of bed, you can't fall asleep again. I want to tell those who are visitors this morning that on my 20th anniversary, believe it or not, and the odds, as Irving Dreesen said to me a few moments ago, were 100 to 1 against my surviving till my 20th anniversary here. The congregation bought me a very beautiful color television with a box and a machine, which I'm very bad at handling, which, by the way, I'm going to try to record the 11 o'clock program on June the 13th, which I hope you'll all watch on CBS, when there is a special CBS program on Reconstructionism. Knowing what CBS has done in the past with many other vital issues, please don't expect too much. On the other hand, it can't hurt. You may see your child's face or somebody else's face that you recognize. June the 13th, CBS, 11 o'clock in the morning. Anyway, we're going to try to record it if I can persuade Adam to set the machine for me, because I have a great fear of machines. Texts, I love. Machines, I still don't believe that my car will start when I turn the switch. As a matter of fact, very often it doesn't. Let me conclude. The most beautiful thing about that program, and the most beautiful thing about the synagogue meeting, was the awareness that we have something precious in this country. A very thin, delicate membrane of democracy which covers us all. It's very delicate. It's very thin. The democratic principle that you have a right to your views and I have a right to my views, and when we are in doubt, we have to vote on it. Not in all circumstances. I don't want democracy to be misunderstood. Democracy is not multiple referenda every 5 minutes. Democracy is not having by our bedside a computer in which all issues relating to the governance of the country are settled by the pressing of a button every night before we go to sleep. I know some people believe that is the case. That is not democracy. Democracy has to have checks and balances. Democracy has to have built into it the possibility of leadership without possibility of tyranny. Democracy also has to have built in it the possibility of reasonable amounts of time. I mean, we believe that it's important to let a president have at least 4 years to hang himself before he is replaced by somebody else. And I think that's only fair, and I think this is true in many areas. Nevertheless, over and above, ultimately, the right of deposition, the right of impeachment, the right of new elections, the right of getting rid of your rabbi or preacher or teacher or whatever, is a basic democratic protection, even though within the membrane there are certain non-immediately democratic procedures, such as the family. No good family can be democratic. No good family can be totally democratic. You can't raise children on totally democratic basis. When they're older, yes. When they are young, democracy simply will not work. If you want to know the details of that, I think it's not fit to talk about it from the pulpit. We'll discuss it some other occasion. But it's important that democracy get too rampant in the home below a certain age. After a certain age, no matter how hard you try, it doesn't help anyway. So the point is you do it until it doesn't work anymore. Now, this thin membrane, is it possible that I could once be able to regard the leaders of moral majority, the Jerry Falwells, with the same kind of magnanimity that I can view the Seymour Siegels of life? I don't agree with Rabbi Siegel. I couldn't agree with him less, yet I will daven with him. I will work with him for every possible cause that we can work together on. I will also fight him in every democratic way possible in order not to let his views prevail in terms of moral majority. Some people say the moral majority are very clever. They give a lot of money to their chosen ideological cause, and they're pouring funds into political attempts to govern who or who will not be elected as senators on the state level now. And they're going to try to do this nationwide. That is to say, the more members of moral majority there are, they're going to be told how to vote and so on and so forth, and people get very self-righteous about that. You know what? I don't see any democratic objection to that. You know what the alternative is to that? The alternative is for those who are opposed to the moral majority to become more committed and raise more funds. You see, we Reconstructionists, who often have services where very few people are in attendance, as a matter of fact, sometimes on a clear day, there isn't an occupied seat apart from the cantors and the rabbi seat, especially at our Friday night services. And people complain and say this, that, and the other. The Orthodox, well, they're benighted, they're primitive, they have more money. The answer to that is that Reconstructionists should become more committed and give more money. People say, well, the Orthodox Jews have all the Jewish day schools. It's a very simple matter to have a Jewish day school. We could have one tomorrow. We have the faculty, we have the minds, we have the concepts, we have the ideas. We just don't have the commitment and the money. There's nothing magic about being a Max Stern, who died recently, having benefacted Orthodox Judaism to the tune of trillions of dollars, all from a bag of canaries that he brought over from the old country. There's nothing wrong with that. Non-Orthodox Jews can give money too. All you have to do is to write out a check. All you have to do is to get a group of people together and say, we're going to have a Jewish day school. And if the moral majority are having an impact on the voting patterns of this country, so much the better for the moral majority in their viewpoints. If you wish to fight them, we would do better than bad-mouthing them and talking about them as if somehow they were crippled, or they had something longer than the other, or whatever, or something else, brains crushed or whatever. Let's say, okay, we'll agree to disagree, but how about coming to our barbecue next week? Let's talk about this, but let's still break bread together. We have in this congregation people who were violently opposed to the Vietnam War throughout the 60s. And I talked of the Vietnam War from the pulpit because I believed it was no longer merely a political issue, but a moral issue. We still talk, we still break bread. This community, this synagogue, this SAJ, this royal breed, what am I talking about? Contains within it the most diverse viewpoints and the most diverse opinions. We even have Republicans and Democrats these days. We have the most bizarre opposition of economic techniques and ways to cope with the problem of the economic future of this country and the rate of interest and unemployment. I don't care how radically we disagree. There must never come a point when we cannot break bread and drink wine together. And the same is true of the American people at large. Surely that is what being a family means. And all of us have an obligation to outmoral the moral majority in decent and proper and appropriate ways. I don't see that they're doing anything that's anti-democratic or immoral. I reject totally their attitude on abortion and sex education for teenagers and the availability of contraception and books being excluded from school libraries. I believe that every book, including Mein Kampf, including the works of Jean Genet and Lady Chatterley's Lover belong on the shelves of our libraries. If you don't want your child to read those books, tell your child not to read those books. But don't you tell me what my child can read. And if you want to go to the polls, then go to the polls. And I will fight you by all democratic means available. If, God forbid, it ever should happen in this country that we would get to a situation of Fahrenheit 451, I hope you all recognize the symbolism of that, because some schools in this country have banned that. It's one of Ray Bradbury's better books. They're all pretty interesting, where we have a culture where all books have been banned because everybody watches television 7 days a week, 24 hours around the clock. And thinking is banned because thinking is dangerous. When people think, they disagree. This week we had a meeting in our Hebrew school in which an idea was put forward that I radically opposed, but I didn't say so. The view was put forward that we should have Hebrew school Sunday, Monday, and Wednesday instead of Sunday, Tuesday, and Thursday. Not a big issue. I was violently opposed to it because I believed in living in two civilizations and that it's important not to have the children all boxed in with their Hebrew. I think there should be a Jewish day school run on Reconstructionist lines, which is available to those who don't want the afternoon school. But as long as we have an afternoon school, we shouldn't try to ape a day school. They're two different things. An afternoon school, a day school, two different things. You can't pretend it's a day school when it isn't. And therefore, Sunday, Tuesday, and Thursday was more spread out. I didn't give my viewpoint because as the rabbi, my viewpoint comes over heavier than others. Sometimes people agree automatically because the rabbi says so, but more often people disagree on principle because the rabbi says so. So I've learned some smartness after 20 years. I keep my big mouth shut on issues that I want to go through. Now, the meeting lasted for a long time. It was conducted with enormous sensitivity. And at the end, the person who put the view forward withdrew it because the person could see that there was no stomach for the change. But in a spin-off, in the democratic discussion that took place, a lot of beautiful, positive things were said about the school and the leadership and the way the children enjoyed the school. No harm ever came from open expression of opinion. And therefore, the goal of American society today is not to create more hate groups, not to draw up more lists of number 10, physiologically or politically, but to realize that we are all part of one large American family and one large Jewish family. And we have to learn to talk to each other. The differences between Jews politically is going to get bigger over the years, not smaller. Ultimately, we must cherish that delicate, thin membrane called democracy, which protects us all, and do everything in our personal power to support it, to encourage it, to protect it, to strengthen it, and to advance its quality. Every possible occasion. We, individually, I mean you and me, those of us who are sitting here today, not fayenem, not just for the others, we must do it ourselves. We rise for Aleinu on page 194.